On the evening of June 23, 2020, a man in an expensive suit boarded a private jet at a small airfield outside Vienna. He had told his colleagues he was flying to the Philippines to personally inspect certain bank accounts. His actual destination was Minsk, Belarus. Within 48 hours, he would be in Moscow, under the protection of Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB. His name was Jan Marsalek. 3 days earlier, he had been the chief operating officer of one of the 30 most valuable companies in Germany. Now he was a fugitive, and the secrets he carried would eventually connect one of Europe's largest corporate frauds to the operational infrastructure of Russian intelligence. 5 years later, phone records would show him commuting daily to the Lubyanka, the headquarters of Russian intelligence. The company he left behind was Wirecard, and the 1.9 billion euros that its auditors could not find had almost certainly never existed. This is not a story about one man's greed. It is a story about what happens when every institution designed to catch a fraud, the auditor, the regulator, the government, the stock exchange, either fails at the same time or actively protects the criminals from the people trying to expose them. The only people who correctly identified Wirecard as a fraud were a handful of journalists and short sellers. They were investigated by police, banned from trading, and surveilled by private operatives. The company they were investigating was promoted by a German chancellor to the Chinese government. Wirecard was incorporated in 1999 in Berlin. Its original business was processing credit card payments for online pornography and gambling websites. These were industries that mainstream banks refused to serve, which created a niche for companies willing to handle the transactions. The money was real, the stigma was useful. Nobody asked too many questions about a payment processor for porn. In 2002, after the dot-com crash nearly destroyed the company, an Austrian named Markus Braun invested his own capital and took over as chief executive officer. Braun was a former KPMG consultant with a PhD in economic sciences who dressed in black turtlenecks and cultivated the aesthetic of a technology visionary. He was methodical, controlled, and deeply image-conscious. Under his leadership, Wirecard would transform from a fringe payment processor into a company that legitimate institutions treated as a serious fintech innovator. His chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, had joined in 2000 as a teenager recruited for his knowledge of mobile payment systems. He had no university degree and no conventional career path, but he accumulated extraordinary operational power within the company. What nobody in German finance understood at the time was that Marsalek was building a second life entirely outside the corporate world, one that would not become visible for another 2 decades. The key to that transformation was a business model called third-party acquiring. In countries where Wirecard had no banking license, it partnered with local companies that held the necessary licenses and processed transactions on its behalf. Wirecard claimed the merchant relationships. The local partner handled the regulatory infrastructure. The model was genuinely common in emerging market payments. It was also completely opaque. The revenue flowed through entities in Singapore, Dubai, and the Philippines that Wirecard controlled or influenced, but that German auditors could never independently verify. By 2017, Wirecard was reporting revenues of 1.5 billion euros. By 2018, it had passed 2 billion. Its auditor, Ernst & Young, had signed clean opinions on those accounts every year since 2002, when Braun took over. No qualification, no adverse finding, for 18 consecutive years. In September 2018, Wirecard was admitted to the DAX 30, Germany's most elite stock index. It replaced Commerzbank. Its market capitalization exceeded 24 billion euros, making it worth more than Deutsche Bank. The German financial establishment had accepted Wirecard as one of its own. Index funds were now required to hold the stock. Pension funds across Europe had exposure. The more prestigious Wirecard became, the harder it was for anyone to challenge. And for the few who tried, the cost would be extraordinary. Someone had been challenging it for 3 years already. In April 2015, a journalist at the Financial Times named Dan McCrum published a series of articles questioning Wirecard's accounting. McCrum had been tipped off by a London hedge fund manager named Leo Perry, who had been watching the company since 2008 and believed the numbers could not be real. McCrum's articles were technically detailed and carefully sourced. Wirecard's response was immediate and aggressive. The company retained the law firm Schillings and the crisis communications firm FTI Consulting. Their mandate was not to answer the allegations, but to suppress the coverage. In February 2016, a report appeared from an entity calling itself Zatara Research. 101 pages of allegations: fraud, money laundering, forged contracts. It named senior executives. Wirecard's share price dropped. Germany's financial regulator, BaFin, opened a criminal investigation, not against Wirecard. Against the authors of the Zatara report, the allegation was market manipulation. The probe ran for 4 years before being quietly dropped in March 2020, 3 months before the fraud was publicly confirmed. This was not a regulator failing to act. This was a regulator actively punishing the people who were right. The pattern repeated in January 2019, when the Financial Times published its most damaging series yet. A whistleblower inside Wirecard's Singapore office had provided documents showing forged contracts, backdated agreements, and money being round-tripped through dormant subsidiaries to create the appearance of real merchant transactions. The mechanics were not especially sophisticated. Money left Wirecard's German bank account, traveled to a shell company in Hong Kong, then to a fake customer, then back to an Indian bank account Wirecard controlled. The circle created the illusion of revenue from real merchants. None of this required particular sophistication. It required only that the people responsible for checking chose not to look too closely. An internal presentation from May 2018 showed 37 million euros moving through this circuit, and that presentation reached all 4 of Wirecard's most senior executives. Within 3 weeks of Macrum's January articles, BaFin had opened a criminal investigation against 2 Financial Times journalists for alleged market manipulation. The Munich state prosecutor confirmed it publicly. The Financial Times called the accusations baseless and false, but BaFin was not finished. On February 18, 2019, it issued a 2-month ban on short-selling Wirecard shares. The European Securities and Markets Authority issued a positive opinion supporting the ban. Germany's regulator was using its authority to protect the share price of a company committing the fraud that journalists were being prosecuted for exposing. The effect was to validate Wirecard's narrative that it was the victim of a coordinated conspiracy by short sellers and foreign journalists. That narrative reached the highest levels of government. In September 2019, Chancellor Angela Merkel personally lobbied the Chinese government on Wirecard's behalf during a state visit. She was advocating for the company's entry into the Chinese payments market. Her lobbying brief had been prepared by Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, a former defense minister hired by Wirecard as a corporate lobbyist. The parliamentary inquiry that later investigated the scandal found Merkel's intervention naive. Former parliamentarian Fabio De Masi called it personal responsibility, not naivety. While the chancellor was lobbying for Wirecard in Beijing, the company's actual financial position was this. In April 2019, SoftBank had committed 900 million euros to Wirecard, a sum that would convert into ownership shares if the company kept growing. The stated purpose was expansion into Japan and South Korea. A consortium of major banks had extended a 1.75 billion euro revolving credit facility. Moody's had assigned Wirecard an investment-grade rating. At no point did any of these institutions publicly question the opacity of the third-party acquiring structure, despite its generating a significant share of the company's reported revenue through 3 unnamed partners in jurisdictions where independent verification was impossible. In November 2019, Wirecard's supervisory board commissioned KPMG to conduct an independent special audit. The results published in April 2020 were devastating without saying so explicitly. KPMG stated that it could not verify revenues from the 3 third-party acquirers for the years 2016 through 2018. The documentation had not been made available. KPMG identified, in its own words, broad deficiencies in the governance and risk control structure. Wirecard's share price fell 25% in a single day. Still, no regulatory action followed. Then came June. On June 18, 2020, Ernst & Young formally refused to sign off on Wirecard's 2019 annual accounts. The company had failed to provide adequate evidence for cash balances amounting to 1.9 billion euros, supposedly held in trustee accounts at 2 Philippine banks, BDO Unibank and Bank of the Philippine Islands. Ernst & Young stated there were indications of fraud related to the balance confirmations they had received. On June 22, Wirecard published a statement admitting that the 1.9 billion euros did not exist with, in their words, overwhelming probability. The same day, Markus Braun resigned as chief executive officer and was arrested by Munich police. On June 23, Jan Marsalek disappeared. On June 25, Wirecard filed for insolvency. It was the first DAX 30 member in history to do so. Its outstanding debts exceeded its assets. Approximately 730 employees were terminated. the European technology platform, the one piece of Wirecard that actually worked, was eventually sold to Santander's GetNet for a fraction of the company's former value. 500 employees transferred with it. The 1.9 billion euros in Philippine bank accounts had been maintained on Wirecard's balance sheet through forged confirmation letters. For years, Ernst & Young had received documents purporting to show the balances were real. Those documents were fabrications. BDO Unibank and Bank of the Philippine Islands both denied any relationship with Wirecard. Philippine authorities determined that customs officials had been bribed to help Marsalek enter and exit the country, suggesting the forgery operation had logistical infrastructure on the ground. The German audit oversight body, known as APIS, investigated Ernst & Young's conduct and concluded in April 2024 that EY had been grossly negligent. The sanctions were a €500,000 fine and a 2-year ban on accepting new public interest audit clients. In February 2025, a Munich court ruled that EY was not liable for damages to shareholders, finding that the legal threshold for auditor liability to third parties had not been met under German commercial law. The ruling meant that an audit firm found grossly negligent in certifying accounts that contained nearly €2 billion of fabricated cash could not be held financially accountable to the investors who lost money relying on those accounts. Total claims against the Wirecard estate now exceed €15.4 billion. The estimated recoverable assets are approximately $650 million. Marcus Braun's criminal trial opened on December 8, 2022, in a bomb-proof underground courtroom adjacent to Stadelheim prison in Munich. The 474-page indictment charges him with commercial fraud, falsifying balance sheets and cheating lenders out of approximately €3.1 billion. His co-defendants are Stefan von Erfa, former head of accounting, and Oliver Bellenhaus, former head of the Dubai subsidiary that served as the operational hub of the third-party acquiring scheme. Bellenhaus confessed in July 2020 and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors as a state witness. He has testified that Braun knew about the fraud. Braun's defense has been consistent from the beginning. Marsalek ran a shadow criminal enterprise without his knowledge. The prosecution describes him as, in their words, the godfather of the criminal operation. They have presented evidence that Braun personally authorized financial transfers to the third-party acquiring companies, even when warned he was disbursing the company's last liquid reserves. By the time of this recording, the trial has run for more than 260 sessions. A verdict may not arrive before 2027. And then there's the question of what Jan Marsalek actually was. In September 2023, UK prosecutors named Marsalek in connection with a Russian intelligence espionage network operating on British soil. He was described as the intermediary between a cell of Bulgarian nationals and Russian intelligence services. The Bulgarian cell had been active from August 2020, almost exactly the moment Marsalek fled Germany, through February 2023. Their operations included surveillance on journalists investigating Russia, interception of mobile phone signals at Patch Barracks, a United States military base near Stuttgart, where Ukrainian soldiers were being trained on Patriot missile systems, and what prosecutors called surveillance on an industrial scale, conducted on the Kremlin's behalf. In May 2025, the cell's ringleader, a Bulgarian named Orlin Rusev, was sentenced to 10 years and 8 months at the Old Bailey in London. 5 other members received sentences between 5 and 12 years. Police had recovered thousands of messages between Rusev and Marsalek. The payments to the cell totaled at least £204,000. But it is Der Spiegel's investigative team that produced the most complete picture of Marsalek's current life. Using phone data and source networks, they established that Marsalek lives in Moscow under the alias Alexander Neledow, with a listed date of birth of 1978 and a birthplace of Riga. His girlfriend, Tatyana Spiridonowa, holds an FSB diplomatic pass. His intelligence handler is identified as Stanislaw Pedlinsky, who recruited him approximately 11 years before the article's publication, placing the beginning of his intelligence work around 2014, while he was already chief operating officer of a company heading for the DAX 30. Phone records show Marsalek's device making regular commutes to and from the Lubyanka, the historic headquarters of Russian intelligence services. He has conducted operations in Vienna and Istanbul. He has traveled to Crimea and to the front lines of the war in Ukraine. In December 2022, an encrypted laptop from Germany's classified government communications network was delivered to Moscow, reportedly via Spiridonowa, who picked it up in Istanbul and flew it to the FSB that same night. The man who ran the operations of a 24 billion euro German company, who was promoted by the chancellor and protected by the regulator, who had his fraud certified by the auditor for 18 years, was simultaneously working for a hostile intelligence service. When the corporate fraud collapsed, his intelligence contacts provided the escape route. From Moscow, free from extradition, he then directed espionage operations targeting the very journalists and investigators who had tried to expose him. The German parliamentary inquiry published its final report in 2021. 675 pages. It found that Finance Minister Olaf Scholz bore political responsibility for BaFin's failure. It found that Merkel had been naive in her lobbying. Felix Hufeld, BaFin's president, was replaced in January 2021, along with the head of Germany's accounting watchdog. A BaFin employee was found to have traded Wirecard shares using inside information. No individual at BaFin faced criminal charges. The system that failed has been reorganized. The people who ran it have moved on. Jan Marsalek remains in Moscow. Marcus Braun sits in a courtroom that may never deliver a verdict. The journalists who were right were never compensated for the years they spent being investigated by the state. And the money. The 1.9 billion euros that Ernst & Young certified as real for nearly 2 decades, that SoftBank and 6 European banks and the DAX itself treated as fact, that money never existed, it was never anywhere, it was just a number on a page that nobody with the power to check was willing to question.